fear this. We fear our reputation. We fear, and so we become inactive. So when the protectors, when they waver, then the reformers check out.
Hello there, friends. In today's video, we're going to play a segment from a larger live stream that we had just a couple days ago with Brother Rob Bertholf. Listen, this is an amazing analysis you're going to hear right now. In this video, he's going to do an examination of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and showing you what the issue is, and at the same time providing a very powerful solution. So you want to watch this video till the end. Keep in mind, this is only a segment of a 2-hour live stream. So if you want to see the full thing, make sure you go to the description of this video, listen to this. Friends, share your thought and perspective with me. Make sure you go support Rob as well. On the title of this video, you should see @Rob Bertholf. Make sure you click that link, go to his channel, subscribe to the channel, and follow the rest of his contents as well. Check out the video. I hope you enjoy, and let's have the conversation in the comment below.
If we really get to what is the true problem, right? What is the real problem that we're facing right now in our Adventist church? I think that we'll start to see, in my last video, I've actually shared some of this idea of these different groups in the church. And I think that each of these groups have their own unique viewpoint. And I think each of these groups have an important viewpoint. I think one group is focused on community. They want more than anything for us to be a body of Christ, under Christ. And I think that if we were to really look at it, this is the main group. I mean, I think if we were to even revise these slides, what we'd find is that community is across the board, and I think that's the desire. I believe is that we have community, but what we find is that community ultimately creates opportunity for division, which is kind of a little bit counterintuitive. But on one side of the aisle, those that want in the community pews, right? Their focus, their lens is on membership, and they often volunteer for things like the potlucks and the greeting committees and prayer groups, right? So, if these are the focus, likely the focus right now is on community. There's another side who their focus is more on the message, it's more on the conviction, and they're focusing on prophecy sermons, evangelist campaigns, Bible studies, media outreach, right? It's really about the message. It's what's at the forefront. The truth, thrust of what's leading them, and I guess this dual focus does bring balance to the church, and it ensures that we hear God's message as well as that there are people there to hear the message. Right? There's a membership in order to receive the message. I think both sides are important, but I do believe that it starts with community, and the conviction side, as we find, starts to be more prominent as we see Lucifer try and step in, and his desire is to sow seeds of division. His desire is to strike where we're most vulnerable. And I think that that's on the community side. I think that he's introducing this fear of losing members, fear of being seen as a cult, fear of being ostracized as a way in. An example of this that I've used in a previous video, I'll use again, is this idea of, should we compromise our worship services to keep the youth engaged? And so he'll say things like, the youth are leaving. We need to modernize our worship services to keep their attention. And then he'll go to the other side. He'll go to the conviction side of the house and say, what's happening? This compromise shows that we don't have principles, right? So he's working both sides. And I think that's so important to understand that this is not about the people. Both extreme viewpoints are only there to divide. And as long as we maintain an active prayer life, as long as we have a solid relationship with Christ, we're impenetrable. Right? If we guard against these attacks through the power of God's his unseen forces, right? What we're going to find is that this creates an impenetrable barrier on both sides. And as long as the membership remembers this, as long as we keep an active prayer life, but if we are not praying together, what does that look like? Right? If we're not going to bed with the Word, if we're not waking up with the Word, if we're not putting on a full armor, right? If we're not practicing healthy principles, if we're not practicing stewardship, if we're not putting Christ first in our lives, right? Because if we do that, we're safe. But if we're not doing that, what happens? And if there's enough of us doing this, the church will be safe. But it starts with us. And we need to accept these roles as ultimately protectors and reformers. And this is the roles of centrists. This is where we are focused at. I believe the reformers are there to provide a counterbalance to the protectors. But if we, as centrists, if we start to neglect, let's say, an evening prayer, if we are letting then worship slide, right? If we're no longer making, that carries into our morning, and we're no longer making that time for God in the morning, right? We let the cares of this world get between us, and really it starts to show in our church. And this is when the deceiver is able to push these thoughts. When we let our guard down, he's able to push these little thoughts of, let's compromise to maintain unity. And in this, he lures some of the protectors away. Some of the protectors get molded into this idea of a loyalist. And they start echoing this robotic message. We must compromise to maintain unity. That's how I see, the loyalists, right? And in that, we then see the other side step in. And the reformers are then going to rightly say, we cannot compromise the truth. But in this, the protectors are now torn between two sides. And the protectors get confused. And when the protectors are confused, they are inactivated. And now Satan turns his attention on the reformers. And he tries to pull some of the reformers in and say, if you won't stand up against all this, you're all apostate. So they start to turn on themselves. The reformers turn on themselves, and some come out into open rebellion. Others try to maintain. Meanwhile, the loyalists, right, and their PR teams, as we saw in a video that was published, that kind of sparked this whole debate. And by the way, if anyone's curious why I even got myself involved in this whole conversation, I just don't like being manipulated. I don't like it when the conference uses manipulation tactics through PR companies. I've ran several PR companies. I ran marketing agencies, and I know what that looks like, and I don't like it. And that's why I inserted myself in the conversation. But this isn't my fight. It's just I don't like that other people were being manipulated by this. And now this group of loyalists and their PR team, right, they are shifting the focus away the real problem. Rather than speaking to the problem, which is freedom of conscience, they started talking about tithe. They started saying, see, now you're taking our tithe. And that's what got me. I inserted myself in the conversation, but this isn't my fight. The conversation was not about tithe. The conversation was about freedom of conscience. The conversation was about not taking money from NGOs, which how we started this conversation today. It kind of has a similar theme, and that is a little disturbing. And I think that when they say this, right, they lose focus. And this is the equivalent of kind of as I used it before, it's like an Uno card, a reverse card. This is what we get for Adventists playing too much Uno, right? We use this, it's not me, rubber sticks to glue thing, when they're actually the source of the problem in this. And then the reformers feel outnumbered because they got the crazy rebels on one side of them, they got the spineless protectors next to them, and they have the hypnotized loyalists on the far side. And there's like, well, what are you going to do? Are you going to stand up for us? And they feel like that they're losing, like these protectors, they don't want to lose their influence. The protectors are fearing of losing community, so they say nothing. And ultimately then, the deceiver whispers in, to these protectors, you sure you want to lose it? You sure you want to lose your influence? You want to make a risk? Right? It's like when you see those who spoke the truth, those are the ones that didn't have anything to lose. They didn't care. John the Baptist spoke the truth. He was, in fact, the greatest of prophets because he came right before Christ. I think there was another one who was greatest of the prophets that came just before Christ. And yet, we fear. We fear our reputation in the church. We fear being ostracized. But we know as Adventists that eventually all earthly support will be cut off, Ellen White says. So why are we fear now? Why are we trying to hang on to something that's not real? Why don't we just be real with our beliefs and be vulnerable and open to say, okay, I'm willing to reevaluate if I had something wrong. For me, new data equals new analysis. And that allows me to change my point of view based on better data. At this point, I don't change my view that much, but I'm willing to it. I'm willing to say that I'm wrong if I ever got it wrong. I think the problem, though, is that we fear this. We fear our reputation. We fear, and so we become inactive. So when the protectors, when they waver, then the reformers check out. And this is why we have home churches. This is why we have independent ministries, because those voices are no longer in the church, because they're not wanted in the church. And so they go out and they form their own ministries. This leaves the protectors even more confused, even more alone, even more ineffective. And ultimately what happens is that the gap is formed. And without the protectors or the reformers bridging this gap, we see both sides, the loyalists and the rebels, coming straight head to head. And this is Satan's plan all along. This is the work both sides, to see this tension, to see this arguments coming out, because he's enjoying this. This is part of his plan. It's called the Hegelian Dialectic. And in this concept, it's this idea where there's a problem, youth are leaving, right? Then there's this creates a reaction. So we're going to introduce in worldly music, so that creates a reaction. Then that creates an antithesis, which is the negative, and then ultimately we have a synthesis. So we start as centrists, status quo centrists, under God. But then this problem arises, and rather than analyzing it, we allow it to divide us. We allow some of us to move to the extreme and get so excited about something that is manufactured. Then it creates an overcorrection. So the reaction comes, and the reaction is typically worse than the initial problem. And this is because it's being fueled to be so. This is intentional. And so ultimately what we find is that in the middle, when it says, okay, let's create a solution to this, is that it doesn't go back to the original middle. It always moves. And so the overcorrection further radicalized centrists into rebels. Right? How easily they can now be dismissed by loyalists because they seem crazy. And they're demoralizing the principal reformers. Ultimately, this paralyzes the protectors. And you start to see this chain and start to see how this is just rinse and repeat. And as new crises form, right, this process starts over again. And this is really the basis for mass manipulation. This is a playbook right out of the Jesuit handbook. What we see is there's a problem, right, a reaction, right, and in the center, they move the needle with the synthesis. But this only works if we're being distracted. And so we can say that leadership is the problem, but collectively, we are the problem. We are the problem because the same people who criticize the church existence often are rejecting their own personal walk with Christ. And the message that they're saying, had they been in a closer walk with Christ, may have been a message that was heard. But we let worldly cares come between us and God, and it shows in our church. Right? We make better choices if we are how to spend our time, if we were to have more accountability, waking up spiritually with God ourselves. How many of us want to point the finger at others, and yet we don't have a right walk with Christ? And so when the mad kings in leadership are empowered by our silence, right, we get angry with that. But I believe that the tide is shifting. And I believe that if we were to start a movement, and that's why I love to hear what Liberty Health Alliance is doing, fully believe that they are guided by the correct principles. I believe Leila Lewis is actually a protector who's been forced into a reformer's role. And I think she's doing a wonderful job. I think she needs our support. I believe that if we were to wake up with the word, put on the full armor of God, make better choices, practice better stewardship, and be prepared to reflect Christ and take a stand, we could be the solution. So collectively, we are the problem, but collectively, we can also be the solution. But this is going to take us standing together and to unite. In this, uniting as centrists, we will be able to then expose what's on the left and the right. The idea of this is, if we come together, those who are dissenting are going to be the rebels. Those who are dissenting will be the loyalists. But if we can come together with just a practical and Christ-like message that does not run to extremes on one side or the other, I think that we will find this whole thing calms down, and those on the outsides will be exposed for who they actually are, for infiltrators and for instigators. And so this is what we need to be focused on. We need to start a movement, right? Christ-centered movement, where we're talking about the answer is coming back in the center. The answer is building a personal relationship with Christ. And it must be going beyond rhetoric. We need to actually think about, what can we do, right? What can we do to restore? And again, this is using the principle of restore, develop, and realize, the true education foundation principles. We can restore a relationship with God, and that's our conviction. We can then restore relationship with church members, confessing, right? Seeking forgiveness, trying to mend these divisions, these rifts that have been caused, strengthening bonds, cultivating empathy. We're now able to take a step up and develop deeper spiritual foundations of our conviction. We need to actually know what the Bible has to say. So many of us who are caught into these extremes do so because we don't have a foundation in truth. And I've seen too many things where we start off, and again, I'm going to say it, we'll start off with maybe doing feast keeping. And then the feast keeping is going to lead us into lunar Sabbaths. And lunar Sabbaths, if you keep going down that path, turn this inversion of light and darkness. It's this weirdest thing. And all of a sudden, Ellen White's no longer a prophet. All of a sudden, we are in this extreme form. And the irony is that there's entire groups that are being brought back under the first covenant, being brought back under a form of righteousness by works. But then you have the other side who's practicing and preaching cheap grace. And so again, we need to understand what's important. We need to build more fellowship, more unity. And ultimately then we'll then realize our purpose by living the gospel message, not just by preaching the gospel, but by living it. And I think this is so incredible, so important, so incredibly important to us, is to start working as a community together. Community and conviction, side by side, truly integrated into one. Because Christ, the light which lighteth every man that cometh into the world, that's our focus. Our focus is not to get into political divides. Our focus is not to meddle in politics. Our focus is to be outside of that. You are a chosen people, a holy nation, a peculiar people. And he says, come out and I'll receive you. The last quote I'll read here is that as through Christ, every human being has life. Also under him, every soul receives some ray of divine light. Not only intellectual, but spiritual power, a perception of right, a desire for goodness exists in every heart. But against these principles, there is a struggling of an antagonistic power. We see this antagonistic power from both sides. The result of eating the tree of knowledge of good and evil is manifested in every man's experience. There is in his nature a bent to evil. Right? We've developed sinful propensities, but we must not be ultimately controlled by them. A force with unaided we cannot resist, but this is the righteousness of Christ. This is our present truth. It's the message of righteousness by Christ. It's the message of the third angel. To withstand this force and obtain an ideal which his inmost soul he accepts as worthy, alone is worthy, he can find help in but one power, and that power is Christ. And cooperation with that power is our greatest need. So if we ask, what is our greatest need in the church right now? It's cooperation with Christ. In all education effort, should not this be our highest aim? So I have more to say, but I just want to maybe start with that. And I just believe that if we were to really get at the core of this problem, it's not about what's the church is doing here, the church is doing there. We have to understand that this is warfare. We are battling aggressive warfare, and it's warfare of really attrition. And what that means is that, there's, I don't want to start a whole nother presentation right now, but the short of it is simply I think there needs to be a refocusing. I think there needs to be a coming together and recognizing that the division is not the answer. Being outside throwing stones is not the answer. The answer is being inside. The answer is no longer being a force for allowing infiltration, allowing for division, and just trying to focus on what matters and not being so reactionary to all the things that are not important. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't know the news. In fact, I actually have some really great quotes from Ellen White talking about history and the importance of understanding history and things like this. What I'm talking about is we can't let this dictate our emotions or lead our emotions. What we truly need to do is be in a Christ-centered relationship, be in the center, identify when even our brothers that we respect are being hypnotized or are being instigated. And it's our role to look to just praying for them.
Correct.
And I think we've lost the desire for intercessory prayer. And I feel like there's this concept. I put out a video called Revival or Reformation, and ultimately it feels like we all want a reformation, but I think what we need is a revival
first. Thank you so much, man. This was amazing. This was powerful. I like what you said about the centrics. The centrics are protectors and reformers, but this idea of overcorrection could lead to, causing people to become radicals.
Yes.
Which is, I believe, is actually is happening in our church today. Is that crazy? My question is now, how do we? I think you inserted in part. How do we avoid the distraction that made it possible for the Hegelian dialectic to be so effective among us? How do we avoid that distraction?
I think it's open communication. I think it's not allowing small committees to be making decisions for a greater body. I think that's definitely a problem. But again, just to be really clear, the Adventist Church is the final church, right? This is church militant.
Correct.
But Ellen has quotes, make no mistake, this is not church triumphant.
Yes.
She says it very clearly. And every time Christ moves, a new church is formed. So when's the next time he moves? When he leaves the most holy place.
Correct.
And that will bring about the plagues, and that will bring about the little time of trouble. And so our focus really should be, do we want a new church? I do.
Yeah. I think that would be a good
I want it to be
presentation.
144,000.
I think that would be, amen. I think that would be a great presentation to get into, the idea of present truth. I think that would be a good segment to move so that people can understand what is present truth. I think present truth has gotten a bad name.